My relationship died on my wedding day. I had everything to live the dream love story, but it all ended the moment we said I do. And I never imagined it would happen. My husband was romantic and loving, but after we married he turned completely cold. So I used his emotional neglect strategically to fund my medical degree before I kicked him out. What I'm about to tell you, you won't hear elsewhere. And it'll probably make you hate me, but believe it or not, there are people who understand what I went through, and they support me. Alexander Alec Harris, my husband of 8 years, was always the perfect man during our courtship. He was a project manager for construction in Canary Wharf. Attentive, romantic, exactly the type of man any woman would want by her side. When we met, he'd take me for dinners at Borough Market, bring me flowers for no reason, plan weekend getaways to Brighton. He was everything I'd always dreamed of. Until our wedding day. The transformation was instant, as if someone had pressed a button and switched off all the personality I'd fallen in love with. During our honeymoon in Santorini, he was already checking work emails constantly. Barely spoke to me during meals, and when we returned to London, the kisses simply stopped. It wasn't just lack of romance. It was as if I'd become invisible in my own home. He'd go out with his construction mates every Friday to the pub near Canary Wharf, but never invited me. Family events up north in London? I'd go alone because he always had something important to sort at work. It was around this time I received my acceptance letter for medicine at Imperial College. My childhood dream. Finally within reach. When I showed Alec, expecting enthusiasm, celebration, he merely glanced at it and said the fees were too dear. £9,000 a year, Imogen. That's an awful lot of money. An awful lot of money from the man who spent £200 every week at the pub with his mates. When a man literally changes after marriage, and you have an opportunity to achieve your dreams, are you calculating for taking advantage of his change in behavior? Tell me what you think and subscribe. Because what I did over the next 8 years will show you how far a woman can go. When she's underestimated, that's when something clicked in my head. If he wanted to treat our marriage like a business arrangement where he worked and I stayed home being ignored, then I was going to turn this into the best investment of my life. I started slowly, with small tests to see how far I could go. I'd casually mention needing £500 for household bits, but use half for medical school preparation books. He wouldn't even question it, just transfer the money and return to his laptop. When I started working as a receptionist at a private clinic in Harley Street to save money, I told him it was to help with household expenses. In reality, every penny went into my secret personal account he never discovered. The most ironic bit is that the more distant he became, the easier it became to manipulate the situation. He'd come home at 9 p.m, have his dinner watching telly, and go to bed without even asking how my day was. Perfect. It meant I could study from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. without him even noticing. For 2 years, I lived this double life. By day, I was the neglected wife looking after the house in Covent Garden. By night, I was the future medical student studying anatomy on the kitchen table whilst my husband slept like a log upstairs. When I finally got into Imperial College London, Alec was genuinely shocked. Not by the achievement, but by the costs. How are we going to pay for this, Imogen? We. As if he'd contributed anything besides indifference for the past 2 years. It was at that moment I made the decision that would change everything. If he wanted to be a stranger who shared a house with me, then I was going to use this cold cohabitation to finance my future. And if he found out after I qualified, well, that would be his problem, not mine. The first year at Imperial College was like living in a parallel universe. During the day, I was Dr. Imogen Taylor Clark in training, surrounded by brilliant minds discussing surgical procedures and diagnostic techniques. In the evenings, I'd return to Covent Garden where my husband treated me like a lodger he'd rather not acknowledge. Alex's indifference had reached levels that would have been comical if they weren't so hurtful. He'd come home, grunt a hello, microwave whatever I'd left for him, and disappear into his study with his laptop. Some nights, I wondered if he'd even notice if I simply vanished, but his emotional absence became my strategic advantage. Whilst he was buried in construction schedules and site reports, I was building the foundation for a career that would eventually make me financially independent of his moods, his money, and his increasingly obvious disinterest in our marriage. The medical school fees were substantial, but I'd become quite creative with our household budget. Every month, I'd present Alec with carefully crafted expense reports that included legitimate costs, inflated by precisely the amount I needed for tuition, books, and equipment. The heating bill's gone up again, I'd mention casually over his breakfast. He'd barely look up from his phone. Right, just put it on the joint account. What he didn't know was that whilst our heating bill had indeed increased by £50, I was allocating an additional £200 toward my education. Over 12 months, these small adjustments funded nearly half my first year. But it wasn't just about money. I discovered that medical school provided something I'd been starving for at home. Intellectual stimulation, meaningful conversations, and people who actually listened when I spoke. Dr. Oliver Wright, one of my lecturers, was particularly encouraging about my performance in anatomy classes. You've got excellent instincts for diagnosis, Imogen. Have you considered specializing in cardiology? For the first time in months, someone was discussing my future, my potential, my capabilities. At home, the only future Alex seemed interested in was the weekend football matches and his next pint with the lads. The contrast became even more stark during my second semester. Whilst I was learning to save lives, my husband was learning new ways to avoid conversation. He'd started working later, claiming urgent deadlines on the Canary Wharf development project. When he did come home, he'd go straight to the shower, then to bed, often without saying more than 10 words to me. It was around this time that I began to suspect something wasn't quite right about his behavior. It wasn't just the emotional distance. It was something more specific, more personal. A man doesn't simply lose all physical interest in his wife without reason, especially not as abruptly as Alec had. I started paying closer attention to his patterns, his phone calls, his sudden need for weekend site inspections that seemed to require him to dress rather well for construction work. One evening, I decided to test my growing suspicions. I prepared a particularly nice dinner, wore the dress he used to love, and waited for him to come home. When he walked through the door, I made sure to greet him with more enthusiasm than I'd shown in months. His reaction was telling. He seemed almost uncomfortable with my attention, eager to retreat to his study. When I suggested we spend the evening together, maybe watch a film, he mumbled about being too tired and needing to review project plans. That night, as I lay awake listening to him type in his study until well past midnight, I realized that my strategic use of his neglect had evolved into something more complex. I was no longer just taking advantage of his indifference. I was beginning to understand that his indifference might not be about work stress at all. The truth would prove to be far more complicated than I'd imagined, and far more useful to my plans than I could have hoped up by my second year at Imperial College. I'd become quite skilled at living two completely separate lives. My medical studies were progressing brilliantly. I'd made genuine friendships with my classmates, and I was finally discovering who I could become when I wasn't being ignored or dismissed. At home. However, Alec's behavior was becoming increasingly peculiar. The man who used to spend Saturday mornings reading the sports pages and discussing his week was now perpetually engaged with his phone. often smiling at messages in a way I hadn't seen directed toward me in years. "Work must be going well," I commented one Sunday morning, watching him type yet another lengthy message while his coffee went cold. He looked up, almost startled, as if he'd forgotten I was in the room. "Oh, yes. Big project. Lots of coordination required." But I'd lived with this man for 8 years. I knew the difference between his work, expression, and whatever I was seeing now. It was during this period that I made a discovery that would change everything about how I approached our marriage and my future plans. I'd returned early from a Saturday study group at the medical library, expecting to find Alec at home reviewing his weekly schedules as usual. Instead, I found our flat empty and unusually tidy, as if he'd made special effort to clean up before going somewhere important. His aftershave lingered in the air, the expensive one he typically saved for special occasions, and I noticed he'd taken more care with his appearance than he had for any evening out with me in the past 2 years. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to do something I'd never done before. I checked our joint account transactions on my phone. What I found was a pattern of expenses that told a very different story about my husband's Saturday activities. Regular payments to restaurants I'd never been to, wine bars in areas where he'd never taken me, even charges from a menswear shop in Covent Garden, where he'd apparently been updating his wardrobe without mentioning it. But the most revealing transaction was from the previous weekend, a booking at a boutique hotel in South Kensington, charged during the exact hours he'd claimed to be conducting site inspections. I sat in our kitchen, staring at these financial breadcrumbs, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Clarity. Not hurt, not anger, but absolute crystal clear understanding of my situation. My husband wasn't just neglecting our marriage. He was actively investing in someone else's company, whilst treating me like an inconvenient flatmate who happened to share his surname. The following Monday, I made an appointment with my bank to open a separate savings account, one that would be exclusively mine. If Alec was going to fund his secret social life, whilst claiming our household expenses were too high, then I was going to ensure that my medical degree would guarantee I'd never be financially dependent on someone who viewed me as optional. But I needed more information before I could plan my next moves properly. Wednesday evening, I told Alec I was staying late at the medical library for a research project. Instead, I positioned myself at a cafe across from his office building in Canary Wharf, curious to see who my husband had become when he thought nobody was watching. At precisely 6:30 p.m., Alec emerged from his building, but he wasn't alone. Walking beside him, laughing at something Alec had said, was a man I recognized from the construction site photos Alec occasionally showed me. His supervisor, James Wilson. But this wasn't a casual colleague interaction. The way they walked together, the way Alec's hand briefly touched James's shoulder, the way they looked at each other as they headed toward the wine bar I'd seen charged to our account, told a story that made everything about the past 2 years suddenly make perfect sense. Had no idea what I was going to do with this information, but I knew it was going to change absolutely everything about how I approached the remaining years of my medical education. The revelation about Alec and James Wilson should have devastated me. Instead, it filled me with something far more useful: strategic clarity. For 2 years, I'd been wondering what I'd done wrong to make my husband lose interest. Now I understood it had nothing to do with me at all. This knowledge transformed everything about how I viewed our marriage and, more importantly, how I planned to use it. Over the following weeks, I became quite methodical about gathering information, not because I wanted to confront Alec, but because I needed to understand exactly how much freedom his secret relationship would give me to pursue my own goals. Their pattern became predictable once I started paying attention. Every Wednesday evening was their project review meeting at various wine bars around London. Saturday afternoons were site inspections that always seemed to require visits to areas with excellent restaurants and boutique hotels. Sunday mornings, when Alec claimed to be reviewing weekly schedules, he was actually having lengthy phone conversations in his study with someone who made him laugh more than I'd heard in years. The irony wasn't lost on me. Whilst my husband was discovering his authentic self with another man, I was funding my transformation into Dr. Imogen Taylor Clark, using money from our joint accounts that he was too distracted to monitor properly. My medical school performance continued to excel, partly because I now had unlimited time to study. Alec's guilt about his deception, though unspoken, manifested as complete disinterest in my evening activities. I could disappear to the library for entire weekends, and he'd barely notice as long as his meals were prepared and his laundry was done. I wasn't content to simply coast on his emotional absence. I began expanding my financial strategy. The beauty of having a husband who was psychologically checked out of our marriage was that he'd agree to almost anything to avoid difficult conversations. When I mentioned needing money for medical equipment or professional development courses, he'd transfer whatever I requested without questions. What he didn't know was that I'd identified several scholarship opportunities and part-time research positions that were actually funding the majority of my education. The money he provided was going directly into my private savings account, building a nest egg that would ensure my complete financial independence the moment I qualified. By my third year at Imperial College, I'd accumulated nearly £15,000 in personal savings, whilst maintaining our household's appearance of normalcy. Alec continued his relationship with James, apparently convinced that his careful scheduling and creative explanations were keeping his secret safe. I began to find his deception almost endearing. The man who couldn't be bothered to ask about my day was now spinning elaborate stories about work commitments to cover his romantic dinners with his supervisor. The husband who claimed we couldn't afford household improvements was happily funding hotel rooms and expensive meals for his actual relationship. But the most valuable aspect of this arrangement was the emotional freedom it provided. I no longer felt rejected or inadequate. I understood that Alec's lack of interest in our marriage wasn't a reflection of my worth. It was simply evidence that he'd found what he actually wanted elsewhere. This clarity allowed me to focus entirely on my medical career, without the emotional drain of trying to fix a relationship that had been fundamentally dishonest from the beginning. The question wasn't whether I should feel guilty about using his distraction to fund my future. The question was how long I could maintain this mutually beneficial arrangement before one of us decided to address the obvious truth about what our marriage had become. As it turned out, I wouldn't have to wait much longer for that answer. During my final year at Imperial College, everything began converging toward the moment I'd been strategically building toward for nearly 4 years. My thesis on cardiac surgery innovations had been selected for publication. My clinical rotations were receiving outstanding reviews, and I was being courted by several prestigious hospitals for residency positions. Meanwhile, Alec's relationship with James Wilson had evolved into something that was becoming increasingly difficult for him to hide. Not that I was making any effort to expose it. Their Wednesday evening meetings had extended to include Friday dinners, weekend getaways that Alec explained as extended site consultations, and phone conversations that had him smiling and laughing in ways I remembered from our early dating years. I found myself genuinely pleased for him, not because I was particularly generous, but because his happiness with James meant continued freedom for me to complete my medical degree, without any interference or awkward conversations about the state of our marriage. But as my graduation approached, I realized that this comfortable arrangement would need to evolve. I was about to become Dr. Imogen Taylor Clark, with job offers from hospitals that would provide complete financial independence. Alec was clearly building a life with someone who actually appreciated his company. The question was how to transition from our current setup to whatever came next, in a way that served both our interests. The catalyst came from an unexpected source. James Wilson, apparently feeling guilty about his role in Alec's deception, decided he needed to understand what kind of woman he was helping his lover deceive. On a Thursday afternoon in March, he appeared at our flat in Covent Garden, introducing himself as Alec's colleague and asking if we could have a brief conversation about a surprise. He and the work team were planning for Alec's upcoming birthday, invited him in for tea. Curious to meet the man who'd inadvertently funded my medical education and genuinely entertained to see how this awkward situation would unfold. James was attractive in a rugged, straightforward way that I could easily understand appealing to my husband. More importantly, he was clearly nervous about this deception and genuinely concerned about its impact on me. "I hope you don't mind me asking," he said after we discussed the fictional birthday surprise, "but Alec mentions you're quite busy with your studies. Medical school, isn't it?" "Yes, I'm graduating in 2 months actually. It's been quite demanding." He nodded thoughtfully. "He's very proud of your accomplishments. Always talking about how brilliant you are, how hard you've worked." This was fascinating information. Apparently, my husband was presenting me to his lover as the accomplished wife, rather than the convenient roommate I'd become in our actual interactions. "He's been very supportive," I replied diplomatically. What James said next revealed everything I needed to know about how to handle the next phase of this situation. "I have to say, I admire how you've both managed to maintain such respect for each other while pursuing your separate goals. Not many couples can navigate that kind of independence successfully. Separate goals, independent lives, maintained respect." James Wilson had just handed me the perfect framework for ending this marriage without drama, financial complications, or emotional devastation. Something about James's visit tells me he knows more than he's letting on about the real dynamics in this house. Have you ever realized that the person you thought was deceiving you was actually providing you with exactly what you needed? Trust me, what I discovered about managing this delicate balance was beyond anything I could have planned. My graduation ceremony at Imperial College London was scheduled for a Thursday in May. Exactly 4 years and 2 months after, I'd made the decision to transform my husband's emotional neglect into my medical degree. As I prepared my graduation speech, I couldn't help but appreciate the irony that Alec would be sitting in the audience, applauding my achievement, completely unaware that he'd funded it through his guilt-driven financial generosity about his secret relationship with James. The beauty of our arrangement had been its perfect symmetry. Whilst Alec believed he was cleverly managing his double life, carefully scheduling his romantic dinners and weekend getaways with his supervisor, I was methodically building my escape plan using the financial freedom his distraction provided. He'd never confessed his relationship with James, never acknowledged that our marriage had become an elaborate performance for the benefit of neighbors, family, and his own conscience. To this day, I'm certain he believes his secret is safe, that his careful scheduling and creative explanations about work commitments have protected him from any suspicion. What he doesn't realize is that I've known about James Wilson for over 2 years, that I've watched their relationship evolve from nervous coffee meetings to weekend holidays, that I've been silently grateful for every moment of happiness James brought into Alec's life because it meant complete emotional freedom for me to pursue my career. The morning of graduation, Alec surprised me by suggesting we celebrate with dinner at our favorite restaurant in Borough Market. the same place he'd taken me during our early dating years. His enthusiasm seemed genuine, almost nostalgic, as if marking my achievement had triggered some memory of the couple we used to be. "I'm really proud of you, Imogen," he said over breakfast, looking directly at me with more attention than he'd shown in months. "I know the past few years haven't been easy, with all the studying and the pressure. But you've done something incredible. The past few years haven't been easy." If only he knew how easy they'd actually been once I'd stopped trying to fix our marriage and started using it as a strategic tool instead. But his moment of genuine connection created an unexpected problem. If Alec was planning to recommit to our marriage now that my medical degree was complete, it would complicate the exit strategy I'd been carefully constructing. Have you ever been in a situation where someone's guilty conscience makes them want to reconnect with you, just when you finally moved beyond needing their attention? The timing couldn't have been worse for what I was about to do next. That afternoon, I attended the graduation ceremony with a speech prepared that would serve multiple purposes. Publicly, it would be a gracious acknowledgement of the support that had made my medical education possible. Privately, it would be the opening move in the final phase of my plan doc as I walked across the stage to receive my degree. I spotted Alec in the audience, clapping enthusiastically, his face showing genuine pride and affection. Sitting 3 rows behind him, I also noticed James Wilson, who'd apparently taken time away from the construction site to attend his lover's wife's graduation ceremony, a gesture that struck me as both touching and absurd. The moment was perfect, complex, layered with secrets and genuine emotions that none of us were acknowledging directly. When I reached the podium to deliver my speech, I looked out at an audience that included my husband, his secret lover, my medical school colleagues who'd become genuine friends, and family members who'd watched me transform from a neglected wife into Dr. Imogen Taylor Clark. 4 years ago I discovered that sometimes the most important education happens not in lecture halls, but in learning to recognize what you actually deserve in life. Medical school taught me to diagnose problems accurately, but real life taught me that sometimes the best treatment isn't trying to fix something that's fundamentally broken. I saw Alec's expression shift slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face as if he sensed something significant in my words that he couldn't quite identify. But what I said next would ensure that today marked the beginning of the end of the most successful strategic arrangement of my life, even though everyone in that audience believed they were celebrating my new beginning. The dinner at Barrow Market that evening was the most surreal experience of our entire marriage. Alec had chosen the same restaurant where he'd proposed 6 years earlier, and he seemed determined to recreate the romantic atmosphere of our early relationship, complete with the wine he'd ordered on our first date and flowers that matched the bouquet he'd given me when I'd accepted his proposal. But I wasn't the same woman who'd been charmed by his gestures, and he wasn't the same man who'd made them. We were both performing versions of ourselves that had expired years ago, for reasons that neither of us was willing to acknowledge directly. "I've been thinking," he said, reaching across the table to take my hand in a gesture that felt both familiar and foreign. "Now that you've graduated, maybe we could plan that trip to Italy we always talked about. Take some time to reconnect, celebrate your achievement properly." Italy, the trip we'd discussed during our engagement, when we'd imagined ourselves exploring Rome and Florence together, sharing wine and discovering art that would inspire meaningful conversations about our future. The irony was devastating. Here was my husband, apparently experiencing some crisis of conscience about the emotional distance in our marriage, trying to rebuild something with me whilst maintaining his relationship with James Wilson, completely unaware that I'd been strategically using his guilt-driven generosity to finance my independence. "That sounds lovely," I replied, squeezing his hand with what I hoped appeared to be genuine warmth. Though I should mention that I've received an offer for a residency position that would require me to start quite soon. This wasn't entirely true. I'd received several offers, but I hadn't accepted any of them yet because I was still finalizing the details of my exit strategy. Alec's face brightened with what appeared to be sincere interest. That's fantastic news. Which hospital? What specialty? For a moment, I almost felt guilty about what I was planning to do to this man, who seemed genuinely proud of my accomplishments, who was making a real effort to reconnect with me, who had no idea that I'd spent the past 4 years viewing our marriage as a convenient funding mechanism for my career development. But then I remembered the 2 years I'd spent wondering what I'd done wrong to lose his attention. The evenings I'd waited for him to come home from his project meetings with James. The mornings I'd woken up next to someone who treated me like a flatmate rather than his wife. He'd made his choice long before I'd made mine. The difference was that my choice had been strategic, whilst his had been emotional. And now we were both living with the consequences. I haven't decided which offer to accept yet, I said carefully. There are several opportunities that would be quite geographically challenging for our current arrangement. Alec nodded thoughtfully, apparently interpreting my words as concern about his career rather than a coded warning about the future of our marriage. We'll make it work, he said with confidence that would have been touching if it weren't so completely misplaced. Couples manage these challenges all the time. The important thing is that we're both pursuing what makes us fulfilled. If only he knew how accurately he'd just described our marriage for the past 4 years. Looking back now, I think that dinner was the moment when everything became inevitable. When all the strategic choices I'd made started converging toward a conclusion that would surprise everyone involved. Including me. The waiter brought our dessert, the same tiramisu we'd shared on our first anniversary. And Alec began telling me about his plans for the weekend. Some work project that would require his attention Saturday afternoon and evening. I smiled and nodded, fully aware that his weekend plans involved a romantic getaway with James Wilson to celebrate my graduation in ways that Alec would never share with me. Whilst he sat across from me making promises about Italian holidays and marital reconnection. The complexity of maintaining this performance was becoming exhausting for both of us. Though I suspected I was the only one who understood exactly how many layers of deception we were managing simultaneously. But tomorrow would bring the phone call that would change everything. The opportunity I'd been waiting for that would allow me to execute the final phase of my plan, with the timing and precision that 4 years of medical training had taught me to value above all else. The phone call came on Friday morning whilst Alec was in the shower, preparing for what I knew was actually his romantic weekend getaway with James Wilson disguised as a critical site inspection in Brighton. The caller was Dr. Sarah Mitchell, Chief of Cardiology at Edinburgh Royal Infirmary, offering me a residency position that would begin the following month. Dr. Taylor Clark, your research on cardiac surgery innovations has impressed our entire department. We'd like to offer you a position that would fast-track your specialization, with opportunities for research publication and international conference presentations. The compensation package includes housing assistance, and Edinburgh offers an excellent quality of life for medical professionals. Edinburgh, 8 hours away from London by car, far enough to require complete relocation. Close enough for weekend visits if someone were genuinely committed to maintaining a relationship. The position would require a 5-year commitment, Dr. Mitchell continued. But it's the kind of opportunity that could establish your reputation internationally. Would you be interested in discussing details? As I listened to her describe the research facilities, the surgical training programs, and the academic opportunities, I realized that this offer represented something more valuable than just career advancement. It was the perfect exit strategy, professionally justifiable and geographically decisive. I'm very interested, I told Dr. Mitchell. When would you need a decision? We'd prefer confirmation within 2 weeks. The position is quite competitive, and we have other candidates. But your Imperial College recommendations were exceptional. After we hung up, I sat in our kitchen listening to Alec singing in the shower, probably anticipating his weekend with James, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Genuine excitement about my future. But here's what nobody understood about my motivations. Not even myself until that phone call. The past 4 years hadn't just been about using Alec's guilt and emotional absence to fund my medical degree. They'd been about discovering who I could become when I stopped trying to fix something that was fundamentally incompatible. The woman who'd married Alec Harris had believed that love meant compromise, accommodation, and patient understanding. When someone you cared about seemed to be pulling away, Dr. Imogen Taylor Clark understood that. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is recognize when two people have grown into incompatible versions of themselves and create space for both of them to find happiness elsewhere. Alec emerged from the bathroom, adjusting his weekend bag with the kind of careful attention to detail that I now recognized as excitement about seeing James. "I'll be back Sunday evening," he said, kissing my cheek with affection that felt genuine but misdirected. "Maybe we can start planning that Italy trip." "Actually, I have some news," I said. "I received a job offer this morning. In Edinburgh." I watched his face process this information. Saw the moment when he understood that accepting would mean the end of our current living arrangement. Possibly the end of our marriage as we'd constructed it. "Edinburgh is quite far," he said carefully. "Yes, it is." We looked at each other across our kitchen, both of us recognizing that this conversation was about more than geography or career opportunities. This was about whether we wanted to continue performing a marriage that had satisfied neither of us for years. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is admit that something isn't working, even when admitting it means losing the security of familiar dysfunction. But what happened next would test whether either of us was actually brave enough for that kind of honesty. "How long would you be gone?" he asked. 5 years minimum. Possibly permanent, depending on how the research opportunities develop. The silence stretched between us, filled with everything we hadn't been saying to each other for years. Everything we'd both been avoiding whilst pursuing our separate versions of fulfillment. Finally, Alex set down his weekend bag and sat across from me at the table where I'd spent so many late nights studying, whilst he'd been texting James Wilson upstairs. "Imogen," he said quietly, "I think we need to talk." That conversation lasted 3 hours, and it was the most honest discussion we'd had since our wedding day. Not because either of us confessed everything, we both maintained our careful secrets, but because we finally acknowledged that our marriage had become a performance that was exhausting both of us. "I know I haven't been the husband you deserved," Alec began, his fingers tracing patterns on our kitchen table. "The past few years I've been distracted by work. I tried to figure out what I actually want from life, and I've left you to manage everything alone. Work, it was remarkable how he could use that word to encompass his entire emotional awakening with James Wilson, while still maintaining plausible deniability about the specifics. And I know I've become someone you didn't marry," I replied. "The woman who accepted your proposal wanted different things than the woman who's been accepted into Edinburgh's cardiology program." We were both telling the truth whilst carefully omitting the most significant details. A delicate dance of partial honesty that felt more intimate than any conversation we'd had in years. "Do you think?" Alec asked hesitantly. That if we talked about this sooner, if we'd been more honest about what was happening between us, we could have figured out a different way forward. I considered his question seriously. Could we have navigated his discovery of his sexuality whilst maintaining our marriage? Could I have pursued my medical career whilst supporting his journey toward authenticity? Were we both simply too proud, too scared, too invested in appearances to admit that our needs had diverged? Maybe, I said finally, that maybe we both needed to become different people before we could have this kind of conversation. He nodded, understanding something unspoken in my response. The Edinburgh position, he continued. It's what you've been working toward, isn't it? Not just the degree, but the independence. The chance to build something that's entirely yours. Yes. And if you stayed in London, continue trying to make this work between us, would you always wonder what you'd given up? The question revealed more emotional intelligence than Alec had demonstrated in years. A recognition that my career ambitions weren't just professional goals, but evidence of fundamental changes in what I wanted from life. Probably, I admitted. We sat quietly for several minutes, both of us processing the implications of what we were discussing. This wasn't a fight about who was right or wrong. It wasn't recriminations about unmet needs or unfulfilled promises. This was two people who'd grown into incompatible versions of themselves, trying to figure out how to separate with dignity and mutual respect. I don't want you to give up Edinburgh for a marriage that hasn't been working, Alex said finally. And honestly, I don't think I can promise to be the husband you'd need me to be if you stayed. There it was. The admission that had been lurking underneath every conversation we'd avoided for the past 4 years. Not a confession about James. Not an acknowledgement of my strategic financial management. Just the simple recognition that we'd both changed in ways that made our marriage unsustainable. So what do we do? I asked. I think, Alex said carefully, we give each other permission to want different things. You take Edinburgh. Build the career you've earned. I figure out what I actually want from my life, instead of trying to maintain something that's making us both miserable. Have you ever had a conversation that felt like the most mature decision you'd ever made, whilst knowing that you were both still keeping your biggest secrets? Because that's exactly where we found ourselves, being more honest than we'd been in years, while still maintaining the deceptions that had defined our marriage. We'll need to discuss practical arrangements, I said. The house, finances, legal details. We will, Alec agreed. But Imogen, I want you to know that watching you become Dr. Taylor Clark has been incredible. Whatever else has gone wrong between us, I'm genuinely proud of what you've accomplished. As I packed for Edinburgh 3 weeks later, I reflected on the strange gift that our failed marriage had given both of us. Alec had discovered his authentic sexuality, whilst maintaining the social respectability that his career required. I had achieved complete financial independence whilst developing the emotional strength that comes from rebuilding your identity from scratch. Neither of us had gotten what we'd expected from marriage, but we'd both gotten what we actually needed. The time and space to become the people we were meant to be. 3 years into my Edinburgh residency, I received news that Alec had quietly moved in with James Wilson, and that they were planning a civil partnership ceremony in the spring. The information came through Dr. Oliver Wright, my former Imperial College lecturer, who'd remained friends with both of us, and served as an unofficial bridge between our separate lives. They seemed genuinely happy, Oliver told me during one of his visits to Edinburgh. Alec talks about you with enormous respect. Says you handled the divorce with more grace than he deserved. James seems to understand how lucky he is that you and Alec managed to end things amicably. Amicably. It was an interesting way to describe the most successful strategic arrangement of my adult life. By then, I was Dr. Imogen Taylor Clark in every sense that mattered, not just professionally but personally. My research on minimally invasive cardiac procedures had been published in 3 international journals. I presented findings at conferences in Geneva and Toronto, and I'd been offered department head positions at 2 prestigious hospitals. More importantly, I'd built a life that belonged entirely to me. Relationships based on mutual respect rather than strategic convenience. Friendships with people who valued my opinions and contributions rather than simply accepting my efficient management of their needs. Asterisk. But the most unexpected development was meeting Dr. Marcus Webb, a surgical researcher from Glasgow, whose intelligence, humor, and genuine interest in my work reminded me what it felt like to be valued for my mind rather than my usefulness. Our relationship developed slowly, built on professional collaboration that evolved into personal connection. The kind of partnership I'd imagined during my engagement to Alec but never actually experienced. Marcus knew about my marriage, about the strategic choices I'd made to fund my medical education, about the complex emotional negotiations that had led to my divorce. Unlike my relationship with Alec, which had been built on romantic assumptions that couldn't survive the reality of daily life, my relationship with Marcus was constructed on honest assessment of what we both wanted from partnership. I have to admit, Marcus told me during one of our weekend trips to the Scottish Highlands, "I'm impressed by how you manage that situation. Not many people could have navigated that kind of complexity without destroying everyone involved." Complex was certainly one way to describe it. What would you have done in my situation? Let me know in the comments below. Please don't forget to subscribe and listen. Sometimes the smartest choice isn't fighting. It's finding a way forward that works for everyone. Looking back, I realized that my marriage to Alec was never really about love, despite what we both believed initially. It was about 2 people trying to become the adults they wanted to be, whilst using each other as stepping stones toward their actual goals. The difference was that I'd recognized the transactional nature of our arrangement and used it strategically, whilst Alec had tried to maintain romantic illusions whilst pursuing his authentic happiness elsewhere. Neither approach was entirely honest, but both approaches ultimately served our long-term interests, better than trying to force compatibility that simply didn't exist. The system that had made our marriage unsustainable was still intact, still encouraging people to make permanent commitments based on temporary emotions, still punishing honest assessment of changing needs and evolving identities. That individual people were choosing differently now, building relationships based on realistic expectations rather than romantic fantasies. Today, I'm Dr. Imogen Taylor-Clark, Department Head at Edinburgh Royal Infirmary, internationally recognized for cardiac surgery innovations, in a partnership with someone who appreciates both my professional accomplishments and my strategic intelligence. Alec is Alexander Harris Wilson, successful construction executive, in a civil partnership with someone who appreciates his authentic self rather than his ability to perform traditional masculinity. We used each other to become the people we needed to be. And then we had the wisdom to let each other go when that mutual usefulness had served its purpose. The question is, when strategic cooperation produces better outcomes than romantic commitment, who's really responsible for redefining what successful relationships actually look like?